Hello, class, and welcome back. It's great to talk with you again, and thank you for joining me for another week in class. We are going to shift the text that we're discussing this week into two ebook texts that I've included on WT Class. The first book that we're going to talk about is the Sousa book, and then the next, at the end, we'll talk about the Lessow Hurley book. And those are those chapters that you can see at the front are the ones that are going to be the assigned reading for this week. So let's move toward the Sousa book. So Sousa's book and also our topics for the next couple weeks are slightly different than what we've been discussing before. In the past few weeks, we've talked about the definitions of bilingualism. We've discussed how bilingualism has changed over time, the definitions, and also our concepts of bilingualism across the world, and what does that mean for the future of bilingualism in the worldwide sphere. Now we're going to talk more about how language is learned and what process, the specific process in which language develops, and how people would develop not only their first language but also their second language. And so the purpose of this is so that you, as teachers who will have English language learners in your classroom, or also just language learners in general, in terms of young children maybe, or even adolescents are still developing their language. So since you will be having those young children in your classroom that are still developing their language, either it could be their first language or their second language, it's important to learn the process of that and how it works. So Sousa explains that on the left side of the brain is normally what we consider the language side of the brain. Not every single part, but that is the side that controls the vocabulary, syntax. So syntax is how a sentence is set up, the structure of it. For example, that goes subject, verb, object. And then also the rules of grammar. All of those things are stored in the left side of the brain. On the right side of the brain, there is an aspect that contributes to language, and that is the part of the right side of the brain that controls emotional content. And so the emotion people use when they're speaking or communicating is coming from the right side of the brain. We'll talk about this in further detail throughout the class, but after about 1 year, that is when babies tend to differentiate the sounds between one language, their native language, and other languages. So by about year 1, unless the child has been exposed to both languages equally, or they've been continued to be exposed to two of the same types of languages repeatedly, after that 1 year threshold, the children specialize in their native language, and they start to kind of drone out or ignore the other sounds or the other languages that they hear. So in order for them to be simultaneous bilinguals from birth, they would have had to hear both languages repeatedly throughout that period and to continue to hear those languages after the year. But if they've mostly only heard their native language as infants, by about 1 year, they're focusing only on their native language, and they're kind of ignoring the background noises of other languages. Moreover, gestures are very important for vocabulary development, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next following slide. Another general concept of language that's important is that imitation affects language development. So young children normally imitate sounds, and they practice imitating sounds regularly. And the way they practice it is based on how adults respond to what they say or the sounds they say. So if adults affirm the sounds as accurate, then children are more likely to repeat those kinds of sounds. But if the adults ignore or maybe correct that child for making a sound that is, I guess, arguably irrelevant to the adult because it doesn't make sense to the adult, then that child learns to stop making that sound just by the reaction that adults make. The perception of movement is also very important. The brain, as children are developing, they connect the movements that adults do to the words that they say out loud. And so that's how children develop meaning of words, based on what the adults say and then the corresponding actions the adults do. So if the adult says, I'm hungry, and they start eating, then that's when the child starts to develop a concept of the vocabulary for hungry or the idea of eating. Another thing to note on general is that young girls on average acquire language more quickly than boys, and they've also been shown in studies to use both sides of their brain more efficiently than boys overall, and that continues throughout childhood. Sousa also provides a nice background of the types of language principles and definitions we'll talk about this week. And so let's discuss each of those and the structure of language. So it's interesting that even though there are many different, there are thousands of languages, there's about 150 sounds that are the maximum amount that are in each language. So there could be fewer than those, but the maximum amount is about 150 sounds. And the reason why it's 150 sounds, or another way to call that is called a phoneme. Those are the sounds in a language. So there's about 150 phonemes because those are almost the maximum number that the human body, the human voice box can make. So it's interesting that even though we have all these different language ways to represent it visually, the different letters and the different characters that we use on paper to represent language, we all share about 150 total phonemes or sounds. And then phonemes combine to make a syllable. So a syllable, as you, I'm sure, practiced in school. So, for example, the word mom would have one syllable, but the word mother would have two syllables. So when phonemes combine to make a syllable, for example, let's say mom, just one syllable, you have three phonemes that combine. The M sound, the O sound, and then the M sound again. And then by the way, the O sound would be a short O sound. And so there's both the short O and then the long O, like an oboe or elbow or home. That would be the long O sound. But the mom, the sound of O in mom, the ah kind of sound that O makes would be a short O sound. Anyway, M-O-M, those three phonemes make one syllable mom. But then in another word like papa, or papa in Spanish, those two phonemes, P and A, the short A sound, P-A, P-A, those each P and each A together make a syllable. This is a great overarching chart that documents the timeline in which children learn their first language. It's useful to reflect and to go back to this if you ever get lost during this presentation or just for reference in general. I'm going to explain each section of the timeline in the following slides. One thing to note the only word that you might not understand or that might be kind of foreign to you is the word prosody. So prosody is the intonation or the rhythm when people speak a language. Let's go into each of them in further detail. Moreover, as we'll explain also in the following slides, language follows a complexity that would be pretty logical. It goes from simple to more complex, just how babies learn a language. At first, they learn the very simplest forms of language, the phonemes, which are the sounds. Then they start learning morphemes. And so the morphemes would be the versions of a word, like mom would be singular, but moms is a morpheme of mom because it makes it plural. Or also words with the roots, prefixes, and suffixes are also parts of the morphemes. So if we have form as a root word, reform is another morpheme of that word. So form and reform are both two different morphemes. Next, after children learn the different versions of words, and they learn the sounds of words, and they form words, then they start learning the syntax of words. And this is when they put words into phrases, into sentences. And so syntax is how a sentence is composed, and how does the language flow in a sentence. And normally in English, for example, it flows subject, verb, object. After syntax, and then kind of hand in hand, pretty shortly after syntax, semantics start to develop. So both syntax and semantics kind of go interchangeably. They're both very important steps, and they build at the same time and build together. First syntax, but then semantics follows shortly after. Semantics is how the meaning of language, how language is used to convey meaning. And so the semantics is important because the exact meaning that a word or a phrase means can change based on the context. And so we're going to define each of the semantics. But as students, as children, first learn sounds, then learn the versions of a word, the morphemes, and then they learn how to put words into sentences. Then they further develop semantics, where they're understanding the different meanings of sentences based on the tone of voice or the context or the types of words that are being used. Let's start from the very beginning. So from birth, or some people maybe even argue before birth in the womb, it depends on which researcher you look at. From birth to about 6 months, infants respond to prosody. So prosody is the rhythm, the cadence, and the pitch of the mother's voice. So it's basically the baby responding to the type of expression or the type of way the mother is saying something. The baby doesn't necessarily understand what the mother is saying. They're developing that, and they might not understand that the mother is saying individual words, and they might not understand their mother is speaking in complete sentences, but they do understand the mother is directing their communication at them. They're using sounds, and they're using rhythm, and they're using emphasis on certain things, and babies pick that up. By 6 months, most babies are babbling, so that's when they practice or imitate the sounds they hear. Babbling doesn't always make sense to adults. Most of the time it doesn't. But it's the way babies practice with speaking. It's kind of like before they've said their first official word, it's their tryout run. By 8 months, babies start to distinguish between words, but they don't really know the meaning of each word. So they might understand that when mommy says, mommy loves you, or daddy says, daddy loves you, that's 3 words. So they see the beginning of where words start and where they end, where individual words start and end, and they can distinguish between how many words are spoken, but they might not necessarily know a full grasp of what that meaning is of that word. However, shortly thereafter, after about 8 months, that is when children begin to acquire new vocabulary very quickly. So then they start to acquire 7 to 10 words per day. So on some of the very basic sentences, like mommy hugs or mommy kisses, they might even start developing the meaning of those simple sentences pretty quickly after that. But for more complex language, that takes a little bit more time. By 10 to 12 months, babies focus and distinguish native language phonemes. So the language that their parents are speaking to them, the language that they hear most, from other language phonemes. They start to ignore the other language phonemes. They start to specialize and focus on their native language. Of course, if they are simultaneous bilinguals where both parents are practicing 2 languages, or one parent is practicing one language and the other parent is practicing another language with that baby, the baby can still develop. The baby would still focus on language, but they would focus on 2 languages in this case because they now have 2 native languages because they're bilingual. But for example, in my case, where my parents were primarily speaking to me in English, or they were only speaking to me in English, even though I might hear language on the playground at that age by 10 to 12 months, that was in a different language, or maybe I heard something in the radio in the background or on TV when my parents were flipping through channels or something. If I heard a foreign language around that time, I would kind of start to ignore it as almost like gibberish. It's going against my goal as a baby, which was to learn language and learn how to communicate in my first language, English. It would have been very different, though, of course, if I was raised bilingual as a simultaneous bilingual, but we've already talked about that. By 10 to 12 months, babies also start to develop the ability to understand morphemes. They understand that words are connected, but they might have just different versions. And so they start to see the difference between singular and plural, baby, babies, and they start to also have a comprehension a little bit of how verbs can be in the past tense. And so they can see how words can have similar meanings but have different endings, and they denote either singular or plural, or they could also denote in English the tense, verb tense. By 18 months, the babies are now toddlers. They can attach significant meaning to most words that they hear. Not every word, of course, especially if it's an academic word or it's an adult word that mostly adults use. But they can pretty much, for the most part, understand when people are communicating to them in simplistic, child language, they can understand that. They're still developing new words. They still are developing 5 to 7 new words, just like they have been developing since 8 months. So they still quickly learn new vocabulary each day. But by about 18 months, they have a pretty firm grasp of understanding what the meaning of what is being spoken to them. By 24 months, toddlers can start to distinguish between nouns and verbs, and they can use them in sentences. They can speak using those. So they understand the difference between a noun, which is a person, place, name, or thing, and a verb, which is like an action. So they can start saying sentences like, I play, Mom eats, the cats meow, the dogs run, I watch TV or something. So they can distinguish between the nouns and the verbs. Sorry, my dog was barking in the background. From 24 to 30 months, children start to develop syntax. So once again, syntax is the order of the words and how they are used to compose a sentence. So if you think about it in English, once again, it follows subject, verb, object. I like pizza. I make the bed. The subject is I, make is the verb, and then the object is the bed. And then there's variations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You know, there could be more complex sentences like, a beautiful dog barks loudly. So a would be an article, beautiful is an adjective, dog is the subject, barks is the verb, the action, and then loudly is the adverb. So there's, it could be more complex, but babies start to understand how sentences are formed and make their own complete sentences in their speech by 24 to 30 months. By approximately 24 to 36 months, the toddlers have a pretty strong grasp of semantics. They can connect the meaning of language, or they can understand the meaning of what is being spoken to them. And they have three strategies that they do to understand semantics. So they focus on morphemes. So this would be a case where, for example, a lot of times children are still developing their conception of present tense, past tense, and the different tenses. And so this is when often, before they're taught in school or corrected repeatedly by their parents, the children will assume that all past tense verbs, for example, end in an ed. So they won't say, yesterday I made the bed. They would say, I maked the bed, because they're used to adding the ed to everything. I jumped, I played, I walked. All those have the ed sound, so they think that's the general rule. So they understand the semantics that they need to make it past tense, that they need to indicate that it has already happened and completed action, but they might not actually know the exact regular verbs versus irregular verbs. So a regular verb would have the ed ending, like jumped, but then an irregular verb like run would not follow that. It wouldn't be run, it would be ran. So it'd be irregular, be unusual. Also, they start understanding other types of morphemes. So in English, we also have morphemes that denote the comparisons. So when you add an ER to an adjective, normally that makes it comparatively more. So if I say, let's say the word strong, if I add ER, then stronger means more strong. And then if I add an EST for strongest, it means the most strong out of all of them. So children start to develop that understanding of semantics too. They also understand that sometimes that words that sound very similar and have similar meanings could be root words. So they might not know the word root word, but they might be able to understand if their mom says, let's go to the aquifer, or let's go to the aquatic park, or let's have some let's do some aqua sports. They might understand that aqua is a common root for water, just based on their understanding of what the aquatic means, like what the AQUA prefix means. So if the parent says, let's go to the aquarium, then the child at the age might be able to just guess without knowing exactly what it is that aquarium has something to do with water based on that root. The second type of semantics could be vocabulary level semantics. So this would be where to understand a sentence, you have to know most of the words in the sentence. And I gave a complicated sentence that you don't have to read right now. But my point is that in general, by around 36 months, for sentences that are made to be spoken to young children, most children can understand most of those words. They have the vocabulary to understand that sentence. So if the mom says mommy has to go to work, then the child will probably understand almost all of those words. They might not have a firm grasp of what work means, but they might understand it means a place outside of the home. And so they can, for the most part, understand the semantics of that sentence. The third type of semantics is a sentence level semantics. So this would be whether or not a sentence is a complete sentence or not, and also whether this sentence would make sense in context. So many children understand this third level, but they're still developing it. So this will be further developed in the school setting as well. And the reason why is because they'll need to have background knowledge on a subject, and they'll have to have more life experience and academic experience to know if something makes sense in context or not. Because a very young child, if you look at the first sentence that is in blue that Sousa gave, a young child might not really understand that this is not making complete. They might think that it's a correct sentence, but it just doesn't make sense to them because they don't know those words. So if you look at the first sentence, boiling cool dreams walk quickly to the goodness. This doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to a child. It doesn't make sense to an adult. It just doesn't, in context, all of those words are correctly placed in the syntax or the syntactical structure of the sentence. Boiling is an adjective, dreams is the subject, and it can go like that, adjective, subject, and then it has a verb, walk. But, so all of those are placed correctly, like it could be a sentence, but the meaning and context just doesn't make sense. All of those words do not fit together to make sense. But a child might just misunderstand that and just assume that the reason they don't understand that sentence is because they just are unfamiliar with the words. My point being is that children start to develop a conception of context, but that keeps on going throughout their lives. Because the more and more context they build up from their academic experiences, their academic background, and their childhood experiences, their life experiences, the more and more they can realize what's the context. A lot of times children learn context also through emotion, through the emotion used to make a speech or to communicate. So children learn that when the dad says, I am not happy, and he says it in a very angry, firm tone, that not happy doesn't just mean like just just not emotional, not having any emotion, or just not being happy. It means the opposite, that it can mean frustrated, upset, angry. So it can be more of a severe meaning based on the tone the father uses to say that word. So the baby will understand the semantics of that sentence partially because of the phrasing and the emotion that was used to say that sentence, the context. There's some other ways the brain can form semantic understanding. A lot of it is based on connecting ideas together. And the brain is really powerful tool, and it can connect and make links of semantic understanding between different words, but that have some similarities. And the brain can do that very quickly, almost instantly. So one way to think about it is look at this word yellow. So yellow has various types of ways the brain connects the word yellow to other concepts. So words that are associated with yellow could be animals that are animals or items that are yellow. It could be other colors that are yellow. It could be flowers that are yellow. And then within that, once you get to that connecting point, you also connect it to other similar things. So basically it expands from there. So the brain connects what it already knows and makes associations and similarities, and that helps it to recall information and to develop semantic understanding. So by about 30 months, young children have a pretty strong concept of grammar as well. So they develop some pretty good syntax skills. They're working on their semantic skills, and they're starting to understand grammar. So they're starting to understand that there are some rules and order in language. So another way they do this, furthermore, is through context. So without strong context, children might still not understand what's being said. So if you look at the bottom sentence, the football player's touchdown dance earned him the reputation of being a showboat. So even a young child that knows some of these words, they might not understand what's going on in this sentence just based on the context. If they're not from a country that plays American football, then they won't understand the concept of touchdown. They won't understand the idiomatic term showboat that's unique to American English. And so they would be confused. So it's very important that as teachers, we build up our students' understanding of context and to build up their academic vocabulary, but also their informal vocabulary, just general vocabulary, so that they can build context and, of course, understand what the teacher is saying, what their peers are saying, and later connect that to written language that they're reading. So we've talked about vocabulary that it develops first really quickly at about 8 months. That's when children are learning 5 to 7 new words a day. And then it further becomes pretty well-rounded, children start to have a pretty good overall vocabulary that they can use by about 18 months. But as I said before, children are still growing in their vocabulary. And so it's interesting. They've done studies about how children's vocabularies compare based on socioeconomic background. And so basically they did a test where they asked 3-year-old children from various different socioeconomic groups, from children whose mothers or parents were on welfare, children whose parents or mothers were from the middle or lower class, and then children's parents or mothers who were from the upper class. And they compared their total number of words they knew, their vocabulary size. And if you look at that graph to the right, table 1.1, there's a big difference between how much vocabulary a child growing up in wealthy conditions or in wealthy circumstances, the upper class, knows than someone who comes from a socioeconomic status of welfare background or in a situation whose parents qualify for welfare. And let's explain why. It's certainly not because of IQ. There is no IQ difference between someone based on their income. It's based primarily on how vocabulary comes from parents, and it's a result of parent to toddler conversations. So they found that children from wealthier backgrounds were receiving more parent to toddler conversations, and also they were receiving more academic and a wider span of vocabulary words. So they also looked at the kind of words that parents were using and speaking to their children, and they found a big difference based on social class. So the more educated, which often went hand in hand with the more wealthy parents, the broader was their vocabulary, and the more different types of words and the wider scale of vocabulary they used to speak to their toddlers. Therefore, their toddlers developed a wider vocabulary as a result. Unfortunately, this gap, not only does it hurt those 3-year-old students when they're getting ready to enter pre-K or daycare, it also affects them throughout their lives, because they did studies and they found that the gap in vocabulary at that point can also affect children's ability to learn new vocabulary words. And so the students that had a wider vocabulary learned new words much more quicker than students who had a lower vocabulary. They also did an interesting study that looking at with the ELL students, the English language learner students, they found that the English language learner students with a much broader vocabulary in their first language were more successful in learning their second language. And the reason why is because English language learners often try to match or correlate their understanding and transfer their understanding from their first language to their second language. And so especially with cognates, for example, when a younger child hears the word science and then they think, oh, that sounds like the word ciencia in Spanish, and so they connect that meaning that through the cognates. So this once again reiterates the importance of English language learners developing a strong vocabulary in their first language so that they can transfer and acquire their second language. In the United States, it would be English, at a much quicker pace. Sousa explains that beyond those 3 types of semantics we talked about, there's also ways that children comprehend things. There's 2 types of comprehension. You have the explicit comprehension, which is straightforward. It's a direct way, speaking to the point, like, I am hungry, my dog is barking, my cat is scared. Very direct speaking. And that would be explicit comprehension, because it wouldn't take much for a child to understand that. But implicit comprehension is the opposite. It's more difficult for children to understand. They have to make inferences to understand what the speaker is implying, or they have to build connections with their prior knowledge. So I use the example below that sometimes many teachers, especially younger teachers, teachers of younger grades, will want to make these broad statements in hopes that children will follow that. Like, maybe the quietest students will be able to understand my instructions the most. So this teacher is not just wanting to tell the students the benefits of being quiet or what will happen to the quietest students. The teacher is implying that she or he wants the students to be one of the quietest people and to want to be the quietest person so that they can learn more and that the students will see the benefit of learning in general. And so they've done studies and they've shown that teachers are more effective in transferring meaning and transmitting meaning to their students and what they're saying if they speak explicitly and they use explicit forms of communication so that students' explicit comprehension can easily be done. So in that example, instead of saying the quietest students will learn the most, the teacher will say, I want you guys to be quiet so that you can learn. That's more direct and explicit. Another way to build semantic understanding and meaning is to use context clues. And it's important to teach students explicitly how to develop context clues and how to use context clues. And so there's 3 types of ways you could teach students context clues. First of all, you could talk about the styles of speech. So there's formal versus informal. There's also the types of certainty reflected in the speech pattern. So when you speak to your boss, you might be more open-minded. You might be less certain in your speech. You might say, probably we should, or it may be a good idea that, or I think. But if you're with your best friend, then you might just say, you should do this, or this is silly. You'll be straight to the point. And so that's once again reflects the styles and forms of speech, how you use a different style and a different form of speech based on who you communicate to. And so children are learning that, and one way they learn that is through using context clues. So if they're in a situation where they know the speaker and they're familiar and comfortable with the speaker, they might be very informal. But when they are in the school setting or when they're with someone they don't know as well, they might be more formal or less sure in their speech patterns. Furthermore, students start to develop more of a understanding of the context of speech. So how people are using their speech will be the older students get, the easier they understand what is the emotion and therefore the meaning that's being reflected in the speech. Sousa shows that for bilingualism, there's different types of brain patterns that are used. So if you look at the scan, bilinguals use different parts of their brain to learn language. And they also have more quicker or faster processing patterns. So they're able to process language more quickly from both sides of their brain. However, they've done studies and they've shown that people who learn a language later in life have less right brain activity than those who learn language early on. And that's one reason people think that could be the explanation for why people who learn a language later in life often maintain their accent. So Sousa explains that multilingualism is beneficial and that environmental exposure to various languages can build neural or brain networks. And so if you expose children to different languages as a young age, they will have those neural networks which will further allow them to learn other languages when they get older. Also, because of those connections and those neural networks, after learning a second language, it becomes easier and easier to learn more languages. And that they've also done studies that learning two languages from birth at the same time does not hurt development of the native language or the majority language. So if a bilingual family was worried that they would hurt their children's ability to learn English if they taught them both English and Spanish, they would be incorrect. There would be no negatives with teaching, with one parent, for example, speaking only in English to the child and the other parent speaking only in Spanish to the child. In fact, there would be a positive benefit because that child would become bilingual and have more overall brain functioning and activity. And they would have marketable skills that they could use later in life, and they could, of course, communicate with twice as many people as they could beforehand. And of course, those many of the skills we talked about in the prior lessons would go on for that child. There's different opinions about an age of opportunity to learn a different language. For example, Lessow Hurley disagrees with what Sousa says, but they have done studies that show that, once again, normally after about mid-adolescence, if you're learning a second language, most of the time that speaker will have an accent that reflects their native language background. So basically their native language, they'll use some of the native language pronunciation and phoneme patterns to pronounce words in the second language, which could give them an accent in that second language. In order to be able to learn a second language, it's very important that long-term memory be activated, and that the working memory, not only do they have that long-term memory of what the meaning of the words are, but they are able to use it regularly in their working memory in their everyday practices. Furthermore, there's different types of language transfer. So language transfer in general is a very positive thing. It's when a child or a student or an adult, whoever, uses skills from their first language, or uses what they've known, or the habits they've formed from their first language, and transfer it to learning a second language. And there's two types. There's positive transfer and there's negative transfer. And so positive transfer is often the most common. An example would be when children use their sound knowledge, their phonemic knowledge, and their semantic knowledge, their knowledge of words, their knowledge of emotion and expression, their knowledge of the importance of comprehending speech. They can transfer that from one language to another language. They also can often transfer their syntactical knowledge, their syntax knowledge. So many languages have common syntax. Many of both English and German and Romantic languages, so French, Spanish, Portuguese, they have a subject, verb, object sentence structure. And so it's not exactly the same syntactical structure, but it's similar. And so students can transfer their knowledge of syntax in their first language to those other second languages if their syntax is relatively similar. Also, of course, cognates that are true and accurate, like material in English is the same as material in Spanish. And so they're cognates, they mean the same. So, but on the other side of that, though, there is negative transfer. And so this would occur when maybe a student is a speaker of a language such as, let's say, Chinese, for example, and they're learning their second language, which is English, Well, one part of the language that will be a negative transfer will be the grammatical structure, because Chinese has a different grammatical structure than English. Overall, the children will still benefit from having a strong background in their first language, because they'll be able to transfer their phonetic knowledge, they'll be able to transfer many of the skills they've learned, their literacy skills, um, the importance of demonstrating meaning in a sentence, the idea of a complete thought or a complete sentence. They can transfer a lot of those skills from their first language to their second language. They just can't transfer that one aspect of grammar. And so that would be a negative transfer. Another type of negative transfer would be a false cognate. So we talked about correct cognates, true cognates, but a false cognate would be like embarrassed in English sounds like the Spanish word embarazada. But embarazada means pregnant. It does not mean embarrassed. So that would be a false cognate, because if students are trying to transfer, let's say, from English to Spanish, and they use that cognate, they will not be explaining the correct meaning. So that would be a case of negative transfer. But once again, overall, the more developed students are in their first language, the more vocabulary they have, the more phonemic knowledge they have, the more literacy skills they have, the more reading comprehension skills they have, and writing skills they have in their first language, the easier it is to learn a second language. So most of the time it's positive transfer. There's just a few cases of negative transfer. They've actually, so going into that in further detail, they've done studies where English language learners, they've done studies to see how much native language instruction they've had and how long it took for them to learn English as their second language. And so this kind of data demonstrates that for students that had 2 or 3 years of formal education in their home language, they were able to learn English at the same level as typical English speakers in about 5 to 7 years. But children who had no formal education in their first language, in their home language, their native language, it took them on average about 3 years more to learn English at the same level as a typical English speaker. It took them 7 to 10 years. So once again, this graph and this study by Thomas and Collier, demonstrate that the more foundation students have in their first language, the faster they'll learn their second language. And in the United States, if we're wanting our students to learn English as quickly as possible, we really want to make sure that they have a strong background in their first language, including a strong educational background in their first language. And so we really want to have bilingual education programs where students develop those foundational skills in their first language, and then they transfer them to their second language, English. And that ends up saving them years of school and helps keep them at a more likely to be on level at an earlier age, at a similar level to their peers. So once again, some languages can transfer easier than others. We kind of talked about that already. We talked about pronunciation, so I'm not going to go into too much of detail, but once again, adults, it's debatable, but many times, many researchers say that adults can still learn language almost as quickly as children. The main difference is the accent. So adults have a much harder time learning the native accent. So one problem for students is that if students' first language is not fully developed, it could affect the transfer into their second language. And so when we talk about negative transfer, that comes into situations often when students are not fully developed in their first language, and then they try to go into their second language, and they might transfer incorrect skills or inadequate skills. And so once again, it's very important that they develop from the beginning strong fundamental skills in their native language, and they shouldn't be pushed or encouraged to transition or exit bilingual programs or native language programs quickly. So early exit or transitional programs that want students to quickly go into all English classrooms have been shown to be less beneficial to students, and allowing students to have less educational and academic transfer of language abilities to the second language. Also, Sousa just kind of gives an overall statement that English overall is a difficult language to learn. You can't just learn it simply by repetition. Also, there's many different pronunciation forms, many different dialects, and we have, of course, many different spelling patterns that have been influenced by several different languages. And so, since English is an amalgam of different languages and different forms of speech and pronunciation, English can be difficult to learn for students. So another thing that's important to remember is that you have, and also it's important to note we're going into chapter 2. So these are skills for how we can help transfer, we can help English language learners transfer skills from their first language to their second language. So there's two types of language terms you could have. You could be teaching. You have verbal based words or image based words. And so or another way to think of it could be like abstract versus concrete. So concrete terms or concrete nouns, concrete language has an image that could be attached to it. And so, for example, if we use like apple, that's a very concrete term, but an abstract term would be like justice or knowledge or fairness, equality. All of those terms, they don't always come with a picture in mind, and so if you can, with those abstract words that are more big picture, more conceptual, and don't automatically come with an image in someone's mind, you can provide images to your English language learners. You can provide them with pictures or images when you're teaching the word so that students can make it basically an image-based word or a concrete word to them, since they have that concrete connection they can make with the images. So basically, if a word is abstract, give them images, give them a visual representation, or give them several different ways of using that word in a sentence or in different contexts so that students have a firm grasp of that word. Another thing to note is that, unfortunately, in many languages, irregular verbs play a large role. If you look at the top 10 most common verbs in the United States English that we use are irregular. And that's what the chart shows you right there. So basically, the form that they don't follow the standard forms that we use when we, for example, when they shift from present to past tense. And so it's very important that students get repeated exposure, especially on concepts such as irregular verbs, because irregular verbs are not just rare things that never happen, but they happen repeatedly. But you can't just expect, or they happen very often. They show up, they're very common actually in languages. But the important thing is you can't just force your students to memorize these irregular verbs. You have to give them exposure, but various types of exposure and various different types of opportunities to learn those irregular verbs. So they might hear it one day, they might speak using the irregular verb another day, they might write using the irregular verb one day, they might read several texts that have the irregular verb, and so they're using the irregular verb in many different contexts, not just one way of just memorize, or conjugation. There's also a difficulty and importance to teaching students how to understand the difference between syntax. And so if you look at, there's some syntactical differences between English and English and Germanic languages like English and Romance languages like Spanish or French. So in English, and many of you already know this, the adjective comes before the noun. So a happy student learns more. Well, in Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun. And so that's important. You have to explicitly teach that to students to show the difference between where the adjectives go. And it's also important that they understand the concepts of word order and subject, verb, object. Because especially students that come from scrambling languages where they have prefixes or suffixes instead of nouns, they might have trouble understanding the difference between these two sentences if you look at the bottom. The person ate the fish, or the fish ate the person. So it's important that you explain that normally the first noun is the subject, and that is the one doing the action. And that will help explain syntactically and semantically the meaning of those sentences. So English language learners develop a second language in 4 stages. The first stage is that they only use their native language. They maybe are taking in what's being said, but all of the things that they are demonstrating to the teacher or to their peers or to their parents is in their native language. So all productive communication, speaking and writing, is still in their native language. They might be able to copy some words or repeat some words, but almost all of what they say is in their native language. Then you have stage 2, and that's where often the English language learner will start using nonverbal cues or gestures to communicate. Once again, they'll start to begin to maybe say individual words in a sentence, and they might not just be copying the word, like repeating it. They might actually just be using individual words. They might be able to say run or eat or food. They'll start to practice on their own the second language, and they also will repeat what others say. So they might not understand exactly what others are saying, or they might just like the way, the expression, or the sound of the word, so they'll repeat it. But so they'll practice often in a low voice the phonemic sounds of the language and repeating words. By stage 3, they start to speak the second language. They start to use key vocabulary words, and they start to make very basic sentences, or they might even use limited vocabulary, the vocabulary they know, to make a sentence. So they might use words like I play, or they might not use a complete sentence, but you can overall probably understand their meaning. Like they say, I hungry food. Like they're wanting to say, I am hungry, I would like some food. But instead, they're just saying those vocabulary words that they know, and they're still developing that ability to combine it into a complete sentence. They're still developing their syntactical skills, their syntax skills. They might also use common repeat words or phrases. So they might just repeat a whole phrase, but not necessarily know the whole meaning of it. So they might repeat, we go to lunch, but really what they're trying to say is, I'm hungry and want to eat. But they've seen go to lunch be a repeated term over and over where they physically go to lunch and eat. So they use that as a way to say, I am hungry and want to eat. So once again, they might repeat phrases and not totally understand the whole meaning of it. And then stage 4 is productive abilities. So this is when they're able to understand, complete sentences. They're able to explain things in complete sentences. They have more control and advanced complexity of their vocabulary. they can hold conversations. They can use different tenses to explain, and so they also reflect more meaning in their productive speech capabilities. So people can understand what the English language learner is saying. Now let's shift to Lessow Hurley's book. There are some very common things between Lessow Hurley and Sousa's book, and so I don't want to go into too much detail. She just once again explains language is systematic, that it's built of phonemes for sounds, and not all sounds are, of course, in one word, and different words use different sounds, and some languages choose not to even have sounds. Japanese doesn't have the R sound, the same R sound that we have, at least, and the L sound that we have. So, for example, obviously that sound exists because it's in our language, but in the Japanese language is not used. We talked about different root words, syntax, and there's different versions of syntax, of course, and so I gave some examples. You can look at that in your own time, but we've kind of already talked about these. One thing maybe is prefixes, suffixes, and roots. Those are all part of morphology. So the morpheme is the actual product of the word, like the version of the word, but the whole technique or the whole type of language would be called morphology. So prefix comes before the word, suffix comes at the end. And often you can understand the meaning of an unknown word if you understand the root word and you understand and you know your prefixes and your suffixes. So, for example, if your root word is scribe, like to write, so you might have inscribe, where you write in something, or you might be scribes, like writers. So that could be a suffix with the S to make it plural. Once again, there's different language varieties. The United States has many different language varieties. We have different accents, different words, different vocabulary we use, informal, casual versus academic. She notes, though, Lessow Hurley notes that sometimes our value that we place or our preference for a certain type of language or dialect or language register, not registrar, register, that's a misspelling, it depends on those in power. So the type of language that is spoken by those in power, the type of dialect, the type of accent, for those in power is normally going to be the official one, the majority one, because those people in power work to ensure that their version of the language is rewarded in the school systems and in the economic systems and politically. So basically, Lessow Hurley's point is that just because someone has a different dialect or has, a country accent versus a standard American accent, or has a northeastern accent or California accent, what have you, those accents or those dialects or registers doesn't necessarily mean that person is less educated or less valuable or less worthy, or the language they're speaking is less valuable or less worthy. It's just by practice, those who have been in power have used a certain type of language and they've tried to maintain that. And so that's how subconsciously sometimes we view certain types of speaking or certain accents, certain dialects, certain forms of English as positive and certain ones not. Also, when people code switch between two languages and they do that for communicative advantage, that does not mean that they are not proficient in either language. In fact, they're actually very proficient. It's just They're trying to find the best way to communicate with the listener. And so actually those who do code switch are often very highly developed in both languages. So this part I liked a lot is the implication for educators. So what Lessow Hurley describes is that often teachers focus on repetition, memorization, and correction. So, and often they'll correct students mid-sentence before students can finish completing their thought or completing their point. Instead, teachers should teach things with context or in real-world situations that foster communication. And so when they're learning something abstract or they're learning a new concept, apply it to a real-world situation or connect what students are learning to what they're interested in. So educators should teach students standard forms of language, so the standard way to speak English and the standard pronunciation, the standard spelling, but they should still value and recognize the types of dialects or registers that their students come to them. So if their students come with a Spanglish background or a Ebonics language background, the teacher should still value that and encourage that. But in the school setting, of course, they will teach a standard form because that way students of different language dialects and registers can all learn the same one at the same time. But no student should be felt like their culture, their language, or the types of words they use or their accent is negative. They should never feel bad for the types of languages they've grown up with or the types of words they've learned prior to the school setting. So we've talked about this already a little bit, but once again, it's very important for babies to learn through input, through receiving spoken language from caregivers. And they need interaction. They've done studies where they've put babies in front of television screens, and babies do not learn language through television. They need hands-on interaction and the back and forth, or at least the spoken input and the emphasis and the gestures from the parents or the caregivers to understand the meaning of words. Also, it's interesting that adults subconsciously, even if they haven't been trained on this, they provide scaffolds naturally to help babies. So, like, they talk slowly, they use concrete objects, they repeat things, they emphasize certain things. We've already kind of talked about the forms that babies learn language. Once again, they first start basically just receiving language, just listening. They might cry, then they start to coo, and then they start to babble. And then eventually they start building their own productive abilities to speak in their native language. So they start to build rules of language. Their language changes and they start to be able to express themselves in complete words and then complete sentences and then understand more complete sentences and make more complex sentences and understand complex sentences from others. So they've also done. We've already talked about how Lessow Hurley disagrees with Sousa and that adults learn. Lessow Hurley contends that adults can learn language as fast as children. It's just based on how many hours of instruction and the need they have to learn a language. So we know that there's different opinions on how fast it takes to learn a language and whether children or adults are more likely to learn a language or have an easier time learning language. But something that's important is that personality matters. So the more outgoing students are, the more willing that they are to make mistakes, the faster someone will learn a second language. So often children are more motivated to learn a language because they need it to make friends, to participate in school. They need they receive more support from their teachers, and they have more hours of practicing the language in school. Whereas adults might not have as many formal academic hours learning a language, and they won't have those scaffolds that teachers provide, like partner work, pair shares, where you pair with someone and you share out, and collaborative work. So basically, Lessow Hurley's point is that we can't really tell whether or not there's a big difference in ability to learn a second language or not between children or adults, but it is realistically much more likely that a child will learn a second language faster than an adult based on the structure of our educational system and the types of supports and motivations children have to learn a language, and the types of, once again, supports they receive in school from their teachers and peers. So once again, implications for teaching. This is a really nice point that Lessow Hurley makes. Once again, because it's very important to be comfortable and be willing to be outgoing and to make mistakes to perfect and improve your language, it's important that teachers have a very welcoming and positive classroom environment so children can experiment with their language and practice their language and refine it. Also, teachers should regularly encourage communication and cooperation, because that back and forth interaction in the target language will help a student learn the second language, and students can receive supports from their peers, and many of their peers will be native speakers or might be at a higher language ability than that student that English language learns, so they can benefit from hearing higher level vocabulary from their peers or getting feedback from their peers. Once again, it's very important to build students' skills in their first language, though, before you transition them into all English classes. It's essential that they learn how to read, write, speak, and comprehend in their first language before they can start receiving complete instruction in English. And the reason why is that the more of their first language they know, the more skills they can transfer to their second language and make it easier to learn the second